Okay, to look over Cork's season so far, I'm joined by Sunday Times writer Michael Foley. Michael, how are you getting on today?
Good, good. The sun is shining. We were smothered in snow here yesterday, so it's not snowing now, so that's always a good start to the day.
Things looking up. We'll just jump straight into what's going on with Cork so far this season because it's now there's a 70-day break until they play a competitive game again. 2 wins in the league, 3 losses, and one of those wins came, an unimpressive win against a Westmeath team that I think everyone expects to win. Where are the Cork hurlers at?
Think they're pretty much, on the basis of what we've seen in the league so far, or not the league, well, the league so far, the league now that it's over for them, they're pretty much where we left them off last summer with the same kind of issues around depth, the same issues around maybe kind of the physicality of the team, where the scores coming from outside of Patrick Horgan on a consistent basis, and that consistency overall, like as you said there, like they won 2 games. One was against Westmeath, which is a bit of a battle that they made it. It was probably harder than they needed to make it. The first win they had was over Tip. That seemed to kind of bode fairly well because that was a pretty competitive match. In league terms, both teams went at it, and Cork came out with a win at the same time. You could argue that they nearly made it a bit more difficult for themselves again than they needed to on the night. They definitely, if they had lost that game, they would have been absolutely kicking themselves. Last Sunday against Galway, it kind of captured a lot of stuff. I think they were in the game. They kind of got ran out of. I think even Kieran Kingston said that after the match, he felt that they ran out of steam, basically ran out of gas. They just don't have the depth as it stands,
And it's interesting that he only used one sub in the 70th minute, even though he's saying his team ran out of legs. What does that say about his panel?
Well, you just look at this time of year. You'd wonder. There could be all sorts of reasons. No, absolutely, you'd be thinking they're surely going to run the bench every day just to see what all the guys are, where everyone is at, and just give them all some game time and stuff like that. You'd wonder what the training load is for them at the moment, stuff like that. Like last Sunday, you would imagine they would have targeted it because it was basically a knockout game. You win, you keep yourself in for a quarterfinals, but you lose, it's done. You're done for 70 days. But it does, yeah, it bodes. It just poses the same questions again about depth. They seem to have issues still around the full back line. They've been tinkering around with the half back line. There seems to be a degree of kind of uniformity that they're going to have a pretty strong half-back line this year. I would still wonder about 6. I'm not exactly sure whether they've settled down a solution for the centre-back spot and an absolute solid solution. You had Bill Cooper try there in pre-season games and early on in the league before he had to be moved. And did it work? I don't know. I don't know would it work in the summertime. You've Tim O'Mahony knocking around there. You've Mark Coleman in the midfield. I can kind of see why Mark Coleman has gone to midfield. But it just, I just wonder about that 5 to 9 area, even though there's a sense that they're fairly solid there now, or they at least know what they're going to do. I'm not so sure that solidity is going to sustain itself,
Yeah, because I actually think the full back line isn't so bad now with the options of Colm Spillane, with Owen Cadigan, who I think is a very good full back. Robert Downey has looked a very improved player in 2020 compared to 2019. I suppose the flip side is you had the distraction of UCC in the Fitzgibbon Cup, and that would have robbed a couple of players. And if Kieran Kingston is doing what Liam Sheedy is doing, there's a fair chance they're undergoing a heavy block of training that they couldn't have done while the Fitzgibbon was going on.
I think that has to be taken into account. It has to be. It's March at the end of the day. And people will look at Cork and they'll be kind of, oh, sure, Midland, not a great league. And they kind of went out of the championship last year fairly limp against Kilkenny, poor performance against Tip and Munster. And you'd be kind of thinking, well, but they did also beat Limerick. And what I think is often forgotten about that Cork team, particularly last year, they were going for 3 Munster. You don't win that Munster championship, particularly now as it is, without having a little bit about you. I suppose their performances in Croke Park, obviously, since kind of again go back to that inconsistency aspect, which is linked again to depth. If you have depth and if you have competition, it's much more, your consistency obviously is going to be better. And even that whole thing about aggression and physicality that gets thrown at Cork from time to time, if you've got a lot of competition and training, that naturally transfers itself to the playing field when you're playing matches. So it's all around the same issue, really. I'd agree with you. I think, Fullback was always a kind of a funny one. Inigo Cadigan is a good fullback. He's my kind of fullback, actually. He just does the job. Just gets the thing. He's not. I mean, Diarmuid O'Sullivan was a great fullback in his own right for a long number of years for Cork. But Cadigan brings the different kind of aspect. He's more of a knacky kind of a fullback. He just gets the blocks in. He does the bits and pieces. And they've had, for the last couple of years, they have had good options in the corners to kind of, sweep the ball out a little bit more and stuff like that. So, like, it is a good, they're looking okay there. They've Nash back after last Sunday. They look okay. And I mean, if you look at the forwards, okay, there's a huge, I mean, again, it's been proven again during the league, big reliance on Patrick Horgan. Shane Kingston weighed in with a lot of scores, and outside of them, they were kind of lacking. But again, if you look at the names, there's enough there that they have the potential to be competitive. But when you look at how the other teams in Munster are progressing as well, it's going to be difficult for Cork. I think it's going to be difficult for Cork to make a Munster final and make any progress this summer, really.
Do you feel, though, that the conditions couldn't be more ill-suited to Cork right now, which of course feeds into this idea of a lack of steel? But like, when the sun is beating down on the turf and it's in Thurles or Páirc Uí Chaoimh or wherever it is, that there's a fair chance that this Cork team, with the pace of Fitzgibbon, Lehane, who is obviously more suited to summer based on what we've seen over the years, and there's a host of other players, Coleman, Robbie O'Flynn, for example, that they could actually run teams off the road.
Well, it's possible. I mean, of course it is. And it's what you be, I suppose, from a Cork supporter point of view, that's what you'd be hoping / expecting. Again, it comes back to this idea of the National League and hurling now, more so than football. The National League is like a totally different competition now to the Summer Championship because of the time of the year it's played. When you think like Cork are now finished in terms of competitive games, no games in March, no games in April, no games first week of May until the 10th of May when they're out. It's 2 months, 70 days, it's a total other world when we come to May. So as you say, the work they could be doing now, they might have had very specific goals in mind and individual goals around players to see how they would work out in particular positions, knowing that there wasn't a whole lot to lose. Gain a couple of wins here and there, happy day. The mood down here, I wouldn't say it's negative. I think it's fairly passive, actually, in terms of the hurling team. It's quite, it's hard to know what's going, because of that gap and because of the nature of the performances. It's much the same as it's been the last couple of years. Some excellent passages of play, some very good individual performances, but then you have these other days where they just dip down. And that's why, I mean, Cork are going through a historically bad run of All-Ireland semi-final defeats in the last decade. And, back again, as I say, to that depth thing. They can't get that consistency going because there was, for too long, too many guys were quite comfortable in their positions. Maybe by moving it around, I mean, they used 6 of the under-20 team from last year over the league this year. You could kind of only really say that one of them is probably in line right now to start, and that would be Sean O'Leary-Hayes in defence. But at the same time, we're 2 months away. And as you say, the ground hardens up. Fellas come into form. Stuff starts moving around. Stuff starts happening. There could be a different team come May.
Because like the way you were saying that the public at the moment is a bit like, meh, a bit passive about the whole thing. Was there initial excitement about Kieran Kingston? People think, right, a couple of years ago we got to an All-Ireland semi-final with him, we got to another one under Myler, then obviously last year went the way it did and that fade out against Kilkenny. Was there an initial excitement, or were people a bit nonplussed?
I think there was a kind of positivity around him. Yeah, like, I mean, the vibe around the hurlers by the end of last summer was that you had a lot of very good players. Maybe just as a collective, Cork just weren't getting the most out of them. Kingston had a record of being able to achieve that. So coming in, that it was a big plus in that regard, that he knew the players. He had gotten a lot out of them in the past. He had a kind of a style of play that was probably more suited to the modern game, if you want to put it that way. I think the fact that he also had, he had Gary Keegan with him back in the day, which I think he was a huge impact person in the backroom team with Cork back at that time. He's not there now. That's not to say that the current management team can't get as much out of him, but Keegan has a proven record of performance coaching and getting the most out of teams. So I think that left a big gap for Cork to fill this time round. But at the same time, they've got good guys in and around it. As we've said, they have the players. They have good players, 1 to 15, certainly when you get them out. They've won provincial championships in the past. They've fallen short in Croke Park. I just feel that, coming into this summer, if you look at the other teams, like Tipper doing what Tipper doing, they're clearly pacing themselves into the summer. Limerick have started well, but they have the squad to do that. They can run all year. Waterford, there's a bit of life about Waterford, I think. Bit of energy. I watched a bit of the Tip game now on Sunday, and there was a bit about them, I mean, they went down to 13 men and they kept it. There was fair sass about them to keep going, And Clare, you don't know. I mean, you never know with Clare. I think I always had great hopes for Clare, but then they kind of let you down a little bit. So I think Cork and Clare are kind of in the same boat. Waterford are probably coming up close to them, onto their shoulders, and then there's a gap to Tip and Limerick. So it's sort of it's in Cork's barrow to try and bridge that gap, and they are capable of it. And I think there will be a bit of positivity around Kingston being there, but no more than the team itself. It's not kind of like getting back, I don't know, it's not like Jack O'Connor coming back with Kerry or Mickey Hart taking a break and coming back with Tyrone going, this guy's proven, like we've won all ours with these guys before, It's a conditional optimism, I suppose you could say,
You were saying to me that you felt watching Waterford against Tipperary the other day that the game has changed massively in 10 years. What do you mean by that?
Well, I suppose it was kind of in my mind because I was at GAA Congress on Saturday, while everybody else was enjoying whatever few matches survived the storms. I was sitting above in Croke Park, as someone put it on the radio. So I was sitting in Croke Park, so everybody else didn't have to listen to Congress. But there was a motion, for the sin bin in hurling, black card, which I was interested in, and I knew it wasn't going to get through, but I was curious to see what the debate would be like, And it started off with David Hassan, who will be the head of the GAA's standing committee on the playing rules, outlining various data and that shows that there is cynical fouling and hurling, and there is, what you might call professional fouls as well. No more than Gaelic football, no more than any field sport, right? Nothing major really about that, I don't think. And he put it to the floor that if there was not action taken to fix this issue, then it could be seen to be contradictory that the GAA weren't addressing the problem. So that was fine. Delegates stood up. 5 delegates in a row stood up and absolutely battered the idea of a sin bin and a black card. And I was kind of sitting at the back of the room, and I don't mind that. That's fine. But when I hear stuff like about hurling being a manly game and sort of the fact that it was a UNESCO protected sport was brought into it, the head goes in the hands fairly quickly, because I would consider myself, to be, in inverted commas, of hurling stock. Like, I grew up in a house, I cover Gaelic football mostly, but I grew up in a house with a Tipperary father, Tipperary mother, where football really, I suppose, was kind of seen really as something that should be conducted in the privacy of your own home among consenting adults. It wasn't really something that needed to be shared with the public. It was not. I never got taken to football matches. The attitude towards football was that it was an inferior game. But I always disliked that attitude that hurling was somehow superior in Gaelic games terms. Hurling's a brilliant game. It's got an awful lot going for it. But it needs to be able to step back from itself as well and be honest with itself about what's going on. And I personally believe that the game has changed so much for the better in the last 10 or 15 years. But like everything, there are also things in the game that you'd like to root out. So like you have an awful lot of, like, the physical contact for me, for example. And I mean, I'm going to sound like an old dude here, an old fogey here now talking like this. But the physical contact for me, I mean, there isn't really a tackle in hurling. Like, it's basically go in and stop. I mean, you're basically told. And Dennis Walsh actually wrote a very interesting piece about this on Sunday. And he made the point that, coach now will tell you, if you're going to go in to stop a guy, just stop him. Whatever way. How do I tackle him? Oh, just stop him. Just get your body in the way. Get your arms out. Hold him up. Like, that stuff is a killer, I was watching some of the game, and obviously it was a heavy old pitch, but I actually thought the pitch in Turner was great now for the conditions, but it was a league match, so there's a lot of rooting and mulligan and messing around, and it just kind of struck me that it's the athleticism, the influence of Gaelic football type tackling, the influence of Gaelic football type tactics in terms of the movement of personnel and all that. It's fascinating. It's really interesting. But no more than what the GAA are going through with Gaelic football at the moment, which is trying to really frame how they want football to look. we've got to the stage now where the GAA have to nearly micromanage how they want football to look. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a hand passing game. I think the same thing is going to happen with hurling. Hurling isn't going to turn, whatever little bits of negativity. And there'll be people watching this going, there's nothing wrong with hurling. Hurling is great. We don't want it to change. That's fine. If that's what you want, that's no bother. But there are, to me, in my opinion, there are issues with the game that aren't going to change organically. Rules are going to have to be brought to frame the game in a certain way. But as I say, the view out there is that hurling is fine. Don't touch it. Let it evolve the way it's evolving. And you know what? That's fine. It's sport at the end of the day. And if that's what the majority view is, off you go. But to me, there are aspects of the game I watch now and I go, I'm not interested in this.
Because the black card point of view, I think that's a lazy attempt at solving the issue. I always believe, like, if you're going to punish, it has to be on the scoreboard.
Sure.
If it's a clearly cynical foul, make that a 21-yard free, make it a penalty. I mean, obviously that's something that needs to be teased out and maybe tried out in trial games, whatever it is. I just think the black card is lazy, and when you bring that in, and most people in hurling think that that's been a disaster in football, and not because it hasn't cleaned up a certain amount of fouling, it has, like the body check fouls, those type of things.
Sure.
It's been great for that. The flip side is 1 minute to go, I'm still going to rugby tackle you on the ground if you're through and go. There's no doubt about it. And it doesn't matter if there's 10 minutes off for the sin bin. It doesn't matter if, you have to be substituted like the old. It really just does not matter. Would you have been in favour of, well, look, the black card is bin now, and I think John Horan kind of said that. But what way would you like to see it change? Because I actually have a couple of thoughts on the way the game is evolving, actually, now that you mention it. But just to look at that in isolation for a second.
I think, I would have always been open to, even from the football side of things, the idea of a black ball, for example, so that if a cynical foul occurred in any part of the field, you get a 20-metre free up the other end. That was floated around. There's a lot of different variations on that. They went with a sin bin. Like, you're never going to rule out cynical play entirely. It's an impossible thing. And you're quite right. In the last minute of an All-Ireland final, Peter Canavan is still going to jump on Colm Cooper's back. Whatever. Someone, you're still going, if a tip forward is flying through on the Cork goalkeeper with a goal to win the game in an All-Ireland final, that man might not see Monday morning, and that's fine. That's natural, okay? That's fine. You're not going to, you can't legislate for human nature in that regard. But I think over the totality of a game, you can certainly make it a bit more flowing and a bit more true to itself. And I'm not, in terms of hurling, I'm not, advocating a return to ground hurling and we all play like we did in the 80s. But there's a certain, how would you put it? There's a certain identity to the physical exchanges in hurling that has been sort of changed, I suppose. It's just been changed. It's more of a collective thing. It's more of this bunching, for want of a better word, but this physical sort of mass tackling. And you can, we can go back and you can trace the roots of it, like all the way up from Cork in the early noughties, through the Kilkenny reaction to Cork, through to the Tipperary reaction to Kilkenny, through to Kilkenny's reaction to Tip, through to Clare, through to Cork's reaction again, and on and on and on and on, and to Limerick now, and to Galway as well in the middle of all that, to where we are, and Waterford as well. So, it's easy to trace how it occurred, and it's all to do with, in tandem with all of this, the skill levels have gone through the roof. It's never been as skillful a game. Shane O'Donnell scored a point there at the weekend that was just off the charts altogether. And that passes off as just a kind of a, oh shit, that was a great point, move on to the next great point. We're in one regard, we're in a great era for hurling. It's like the competition is even better than the 90s in terms of competition. Skill-wise, never been higher. I just think that there are little aspects that can be tidied up. Is the sin bin the catch-all? It's not. Is the sort of, I suppose, the basketball type cynical foul straight away to 40-yard free or whatever? I'd always be open to that kind of stuff, I think it's absolutely something that could have been looked at. I couldn't tell you for sure why the Standing Rules Committee aren't in favour of that. Maybe they feel it's too draconian, or maybe they feel it just wouldn't get through. But I think there is an attitude. I wouldn't say, when you say there's an attitude within hurling, you're pulling in an awful lot of people. I would say there's an attitude, certainly within some very prominent pundits and within some prominent GA officials who have a hurling background, that hurling should not be touched. It cannot be touched. And by the way, it's not a new attitude. That's been the way for a long number of years, because it's such a precious game in so many ways.
Just in terms of how the game is evolving, like, when we talk about full backs and we talked about Colm Spillane and Owen Cadigan, I think we're gone very much to either a one man or a two man full back line with other players floating off them.
Yes.
I think and everyone's trying to do that to isolate a brilliant player inside, and then the solution is, where can we find a Dahi Burke type player who has the athleticism to sort of match that? Because full backs before, they were the sort of stand there and guard the square type of a player, bear in the square, whereas you possibly need to be the best athlete on the field now to play back there. Another thing is, because teams are sitting back so much when they don't have the ball, I find out that if you have the ball, you're playing a lot across your own 65 to try and find that space and then pick someone further up the field. So there's a sort of a patience in teams' play that we haven't seen before. And maybe the beauty of hurling, and that's romanticising it again, is always that you just let the ball do the work. You blast it up the field, let a guy win his own ball. I think those are just a couple of snippets of how the game has changed.
I think that would kind of tally with my own thoughts on it as well. And let the ball do the work. What's wrong with that? I mean, if you can make it work, but it's so hard to make it work now because the athleticism has come into hurling to such a degree that obviously the ball still travels faster than the man, but players can get around the field quicker, so they can cover spaces in that way that they can in football as well. Obviously, it's not the same, but it's kind of this. There's an awful lot has been brought over from football tactics, particularly in the first 10 years of this decade, that is now applicable in hurling.
That would be Kilkenny as much as anyone. Mick Dempsey's influence. Like I'm a firm believer that Kilkenny turned into a Gaelic football team with obviously a massive hurling. It's obviously hurling, but with huge Gaelic football influence.
They managed to mesh us. Like, if we want to go back and look at it historically speaking now, 15, 16 years ago, they managed to mesh that sort of attitude of you need to be able to win your own ball. And I mean, if you look at some of the deliveries from the Kilkenny backline against Cork, Galway in 04, 05, those, they were just skying them up they were just flinging them up the field. But you did have that thing where they all stepped back 20 yards. They looked at what Cork were doing with the short stick passing, the kind of the Newtown Shandrum approach, if you like. The hook, they're like Cork's technical play back in the noughties was outstanding because they had the players to do it. Kilkenny matched that by just marching everybody back about 10, 15 yards for the puck outs and challenging them to win their own ball and they monstered teams as a result. But they also obviously had some of the greatest hurlers of all time, which was very, very handy, which meant they could play it any which way you wanted. But that was, I mean, back that time, Mick Dempsey obviously was an influence. I think Mickey Hart was a huge influence on hurling because you had Brian Cody looking at Hart and he was a great admirer of what Tyrone did. So he saw that athleticism and he saw that sort of willing to work for each other, that sacrifice, and that smartness about matchups and about how you can unpick the opposition. And I mean, look, I think we're all fairly well agreed that when Kilkenny or Brian Cody in particular says there's no tactics in hurling, he may be speaking about a definition of tactics that isn't broadly similar to the rest of us. I mean, they've clearly changed the game for better in most ways. I mean, it's again, in terms of the GAA, in terms of football, the GAA have certainly tried, and you can see it if you take the rules that they've tried to bring in their totality, they are trying to bring some more chaos back to football, as in that you can have a tactical formation and structure, but that at the end of the day, there's still enough space in the game for 50-50 challenges, for high catching, for contesting. And that's good for the game. You don't want, I mean, what you get if you don't have that, what you get is what you just said there in hurling, back and forth across the field, lateral crab football, back and forth across the field. And my concern for hurling is that the same thing is coming in. That yes, you still, obviously you long for 50-50 competition because of the nature of the game. But that aspect of, you say let the ball do the work. It's chaos. It's chaos as well. You let it go and see what happens. That's a lot of it is the beauty in hurling. A lot of that, I mean, when I see guys pucking the ball across the field waiting for guys to make runs and stuff, I mean, I know all the work that's gone into it, and I appreciate the effort and all. But as a spectator, I'm kind of looking at it going, at some stage the GAA are going to have to actually make rules to make this more difficult, to make it more profitable for guys to get the ball and let it go.
So you were at the Congress at the weekend, like you said. I do want to ask you about Cork. Obviously, it's your county, but just in light of what happened at Congress, are you happy with where football is at this year, even taking into consideration the attacking rule and the tweak that happened there, and of course the no return to the goalkeeper from the kick out?
Well, it was fascinating. It was fascinating. Is definitely stretching it actually, but it's always interesting to see how some motions and some rules come into being. So Friday night they elected the GAA president, but because they had a bit of a delay in counting the votes, they said we'll go to the motions, because there was 63 motions up for discussion at the weekend. That's a lot for anybody to sit through. So they decided to start on them on Friday night. So one of the motions that came up was that banning the kick pass back to the goalkeeper off kick out, and it was proposed. And as has been widely reported since, it was 2 minutes, no debate, show of hands, flew through, and there was a kind of like a Jesus kind of reaction through the room when it happened, because they realised this is quite a substantial change now. That can happen sometimes at Congress. In terms of football as a whole, I think now that, like we say, there's a lot of resistance to the advanced mark. The games I've been at, I haven't really seen the advanced mark really impact on games, but I'm acutely aware of the potential for it to impact. I actually think that now that they have the pass back to the keeper in and the other marks of various types around the field, they may not need an advanced mark anymore. I know whether it'll actually survive beyond this summer or beyond a couple of summers, I'm not sure. I think the GAA have done enough. The GAA have done enough now to this point to create the potential for more long kicking, more contesting in the air. They did bring in a rule at the weekend as well. It was a really kind of in terms of the advanced mark, it was a bit of a funny one, that if you get the ball, like, you have 5 seconds where you're not challenged, and that rule prevailed even if you caught the ball right in front of the square. So it effectively meant you could walk the ball in. So they've changed that rule now, that if you catch the ball, you can be, unless you call for a mark straight away, you can be tackled by the nearest defender. So, like, that was obviously a necessary one just to make it actually work. In terms of football in general, I think at intercounty level, I think we're always surprised at the amount of decent games there is when you look back on a year, even though Dublin are so dominant. When you actually look back on the course of a year and you look at Ulster Football Championship games, maybe between the likes of an Armagh Down or a Monaghan and Derry or something like that, you'll find some very good matches. Like, I just happened to be at a lot of early Leinster Championship rounds last year. A lot of very enjoyable games there. They're not going to decide who wins the All Ireland, but you can see that the quality of football is very good. The conditioning obviously is excellent in most counties. So it's not. I've always had this thing that football, particularly in this era, is very, very close to reaching a point where it's never been as good. But there are issues that it needs to get past to get there. And maybe people would say football has always had that. Football always has this kind of sense of self-loathing about itself. It's almost like it self-harms. It's so critical of itself. I saw Malachy Clerk in Mary's Times yesterday that compared to we say where that kick out rule just flew through. Suddenly, when the sin bin was brought up for hurling, the forces were out to resist. Whereas with the football, it was like, yeah, sure, let it through. God help us, that thing needs all the help it can get, kind of attitude, And it's tough for football. But I have to say, I would feel that football is not in as bad a place as sometimes it's made out to be. I just think it has that, because of the nature of the style of the game, it's open to more criticism and scrutiny than hurling would be, just when we're talking about both,
The Tailteann Games, or Tailteann Cup is the name of the Tier 2 competition. Are you happy with that name? Like, some people would know that you're a bit of a history buff.
Yeah. Well, I look, I think it's fine. It's grand. I mean, I think in ways, obviously it's important that it has it, but I think it's interesting that they haven't named it after somebody. I think that suggests that, not that they're backing off of the competition, but they have seen what happened to Tommy Murphy Cup, for example. And And so you had a great player like Tommy Murphy, kind of forgotten really before the cup was named after him, and then explained as to how good a player he was. Maybe they want to avoid something like that, so they've given it the name the Tailteann Cup. It's a nice name. Look, it's harking back to the 1600s and the competitions obviously that went on, the kind of Gaelic Celtic Olympics, if you like, of the 20s. I think there was also I'm open to correction here, but I think there was also a very nice tradition for the Tailteann Games, where every year the GAA president at the time went and planted a tree in the original site of the Tailteann Games. So wouldn't be surprised if there was a launch or something like that in around planting a tree for this one. But look, the proof of the pudding. Look, if you look at the Sam Maguire and the Lee McCarthy Cup, I mean, if we were naming those now, we wouldn't be naming them after Sam Maguire and Lee McCarthy, God bless them. But so look at the proof of the pudding is always in how the competition goes. We'll see. The hard work starts for them now in terms of making it relevant and making it important for teams.
And that brings us along nicely to Cork, because they've obviously been in Division 3 football this year, but because they've won 5 games from 5, Ronan McCarthy, the manager, feels quite confident that they're through. He says, I think 10 points will get us there. Of course, it didn't for Down last year. But how do you feel Cork have been going this year?
You know what can you say? I mean, they've done what they had to do, which sounds very boring, but that's pretty much what it is. I mean, they were in Division 3. They weren't going to get any credit for winning these matches. They were going to get plenty of criticism if they didn't. So they went about it. There's plenty of stuff you can pick at. I mean, even the Derry game at the weekend, they were comfortably superior to Derry. But by 2 points, conceded goals late on. You're going to get that with a team like Cork, developing a lot of young players in there. Problem for them, obviously, going forward is that they're going to have a springtime playing Division 3 teams. Then they'll play, I think is it Limerick they have in the first round, I think. I could be open to correction there, but whoever they play, it won't be a Division 1 team until Kerry. And then we are where we are, So like they've been doing okay. They've been doing fine. You can see good things in the team that have come on from last year. But I mean, looking at Division 3 before it started, I would have thought that there was maybe 3 or 4 games where Cork could have come unstuck. The first game against Offaly have actually been going quite well. They had a bit of momentum behind them coming into the league. I heard that, soundings were that they'd had a good pre-season. They were happy. Cork did well to win that game. They won against Down at home. That was a key match. Tip are always a difficult game for Cork at the moment. That turned into a right contest, but they came out the right side of that. And then Derry would have come in with strong hopes for this year. Hasn't really come together for them yet, I don't think. So they did the job there. They needed to get those wins on the board. They have Longford as their last game. I've seen a lot of Longford over the years, and they always have good footballers. And they're always capable of causing trouble. Longford's problem always has been physicality. They don't have enough big, strong boys to kind of go to the next level, but they're perfectly capable of taking someone out. So look, Cork have done what they had to do. They've got some very good young players coming through, but they're also, I was talking to Paul Kerrigan earlier on in the league, and he was making the point like that over the last bunch of years, Cork have had different strength and conditioning trainers almost every year. So, they're starting again now with a new kind of system, a new setup, and it's going to take time. It's going to take time, particularly for these young players, to come up to the level and be at a level where they can be consistent. The nature of the way the championship is arranged, Super 8s obviously is a target for them, but it's not necessarily the case. Look, they went well in the Super 8s last year, but really they didn't get the win probably against Roscommon that they would have hoped to get. So they'll be looking, what can you expect from them this summer? You're probably looking for another performance along the lines of what they gave against Kerry last year, keeping in mind that Kerry will be the first Division 1 team they play this year, and that'll be in June in the Munster semi-final. And then after that, you're kind of hoping for get to the Super 8s and see how you go.
Because it's actually the first game in the championship is Kerry in that semi-final. All the other teams are on the other side. I just checked there.
You'd like to think I'd keep up with these things, wouldn't you?
But I think it's actually like a player. Someone will often say to him, "Well, who are you playing this weekend?" And you probably know vaguely I'm playing on Saturday, and people think you're mad that you don't even know who you're against or the exact time.
Well, I think this time of year, particularly in this job, it's particularly in the football league. The football league is so active and competitive at all levels, you sort of you kind of almost put the championship to one side in your head. And I'm not using that as an excuse. Well, I am using that as an excuse actually. But
Right.
but you know, it is very competitive, and more so than the hurling. What's going on in the football league now will have an impact and will have an influence on what happens in the football championship.
I thought it was interesting that Ronan McCarthy, he was talking about the potential of Cork, and because they've kind of slid so much, people probably aren't considering the players that they've been missing. Kieran Sheehan is back this year. We'll see how he goes. And there was a quote from Ronan where he goes, people talk about Colin McShane and Matty Donnelly being out for Tyrone, but the likes of Sean Powter and Brian Hurley have been massive misses for us. So, and that's a fair point. Like, those are two guys that are probably comparable at that level.
Absolutely, and they feed into the kind of game that Cork will want to play. I mean, Cork will want to play a fast-moving, mobile game, probably ball in hand. Sean Powter, straight away. I mean, he played very well against Derry at the weekend. He's been going well. Kieran Sheehan, I mean, I'd say he's probably the only footballer in Cork who's happy to be in Division 3 because it's given him the opportunity to wear himself back into the inter-county game. And he, again, first couple of games played really, really well. So, yeah, Ronan's right. And I mean, if you look over the history of Cork football in the last decade, it's been pretty bleak, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years. But they have been extremely unlucky with some of the players that they've lost either to Australia, like Kieran Sheehan, through injury, like Powter, and Brian Hurley, and then retirements and stuff like that. Guys who maybe could have stayed on a little long, could have been kept on, that weren't. But look, that's just the way it is. You gotta roll with the punches, and they're in an unforgiving situation that they play Kerry every year. So if it's not, they don't get a break, they don't get a chance. So, like they have guys back now. They have a very good base of young players again, a bit like 06, 07. They'll have a few years now of working through this, and you would hope, from a Cork point of view, and I know the Kerry are hoping it as well, that Cork will be a lot stronger in the next 2021, 22 and going forward.
What are your thoughts on how the league is shaping up? Obviously with kind of one eye in the championship now, even though we don't know when the fixtures are in the championship, of course. But what are your thoughts on where Dublin are at? Because getting to a league final is out of their hands now, and they've been falling behind heavily in games, and they still have that, whatever it is it that sort of never say die attitude, that residual thing there, that they just don't give up, and they've come back in most games. Where do you think they're at?
I'd say they're probably relaxed enough with life. Like I have been at a lot of their matches, and it's extraordinary, that muscle memory that they have to just dig themselves out of situations. And I think it's in the other crowd's head as well that you don't never have the game won against them. So that helps Dublin obviously along the way. Again, the thing that I noticed last year about Dublin, and they didn't have a great league last year either. The only players that they brought through were, they brought back Rory O'Carroll, they brought back Connolly. There was no Bolter, there was no, and I know we're talking about, I'm going to mention a couple of exceptional names here that you can't expect every year, but you get the point I'm trying to make. There was no Con, there was no Fenton coming through. There was no Merchant, not even a Cormac Costello, there was nobody just kind of coming out of the pack, right? This year, you look at Sean Bugler. I think he's probably the guy. But there'll be others. There'll be others. Conor McHugh has got a couple of runs, but Conor would have got runs with Dublin in the league in the past.
Colin Baskell to some degree also.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there are names like that we're all familiar with, and I think they will all play. They will all play their role. Certainly in Leinster, and we'll see what they'll be like. Dublin won't be in the slightest bit worried about things. Like the Tyrone game was a bit of a. I mean, you saw the conditions. Whoever was going to win that match, obviously you'll take a lot in terms of resilience and strength of mind and character and will to pull the thing out of the fire and win it. But in terms of a comparable game, when Dublin play Tyrone again, if they do in the summertime, it's not at all comparable. Dublin have looked good. Anytime I've seen them, they've let teams off. I mean, the Monaghan game was extraordinary. That really was sort of that was the poorest Dublin performance I've seen in quite a long time. But at the same time, again, you'd wonder what kind of work they're doing, what kind of load they're doing. They're getting used to a new manager. The new manager's getting used to the setup and the scene as well. Personally, I think they changed the rule at the weekend where Croke Park is no longer seen as a neutral venue for the Super 8. So Dublin could be could be on the road one more time in the year. I've never bought into the idea that Dublin are unbeatable. If you look at the nature of some of the wins that they've had in All-Ireland finals in particular, they've been very close. I think that they're always, if a team gets it right on the day, and if Dublin dip, it's there for the opposition. I think Kerry will obviously look. It's obvious. Like, I mean, Kerry are quite a bit ahead of everybody else, I think, in terms of challenging Dublin. But again, Tyrone maybe in that regard, even though the game is kind of incomparable in going forward. Tyrone did show that if you have the will and the absolute ironclad sort of stubbornness to stay with them and not be kind of intimidated or cowed by the blue jersey and the people inhabiting those blue jerseys, you can make an effort. You can get places against Dublin, and if ever they're going to be vulnerable, it's going to be this year, I think. You could even see it in the reaction to the All-Ireland last year. They were sort of, it was almost like a weight off them. And I just wonder now, without that push behind them when it comes to it, are they vulnerable to getting caught? It's probably a silver bullet situation. Get them once,
That's an interesting one because I think the term used when Inter Milan won the Champions League in 2010 after beating Bayern Munich, it had been this thing that they've been building up to for a long time. Players like, I suppose, Schneider and a few more. I can't remember all the players off the top of my head. But there was some comment made by one of the players because, they went to pot after that. They didn't challenge for it again. The idea that when they finally achieved it, they kind of expired on the field. So it's a bit of a dramatic way to put it. But I wonder, is there a possibility? And we're always there's a bit of wishful thinking because we want a competitive championship. But maybe there is some aspect of that.
I think there has to be something human there in the sense that, like, look, yourself. Like, I mean, if you're competing for All Irelands over and over again for a successive number of years, even if, like Dublin, you're winning them and you're making it look easy at times, there's a huge amount of work goes into making it look that easy. And at some point, mentally, you're going to get stale. You're going to get tired. Physically, you're going to start feeling it in the legs. And it's only natural that you're going to dip. Whether that happens this year with the 5 in a row now secured and won, or whether they drive on and win 6. I mean, to me, it feels like one of those Kerry type situations where they may well lose this year and come back and win 2 in a row again. That sort of way. That they possibly need an edge now. Where's the edge for Dublin now? Like, where is the edge? I mean, tip hurlers have always had the edge because, it's always been 1 in a row. So they're always coming back with something on their back. Kerry have the edge that there's all sorts of, I mean, Kerry have just gone through the worst decade in terms of All-Ireland All-Ireland title returns in their entire history, apart from the 90s. They won 1 in the 90s and they won 1 in the 10s. Like, that's ever since they won their first one back in 1903. So, I mean, they're walking around with a 24/7 edge. All these teams that are chasing them are all hungry. If Dublin is feeling any way satisfied with what they have, that gap, I'm telling you, and you look at Galway, the likes of a Galway coming as a bolter. I mean, if Dublin were to meet Galway, as much as Dublin will tell themselves they're ready for Galway, the likes of a Galway, they mightn't be entirely 100% ready if Galway came with its particular kind of performance and was getting the best out of Shane Walsh and everybody was playing up to their max. It's kind of game that could really trouble Dublin and really make them think. I mean, I put it this way: if they were to go 10, 11 points down in a championship game in Croke Park, even the way they're doing is Monaghan, I'm not so sure everybody become confident that they'll come back.
A question about Galway, actually. And I know there's some factors that are a little bit different last year because Kevin Walsh would have had the Corofin guys away until March, whereas this year Pádraig Joyce gets them in a little bit sooner. But in the general sense of things, he's got the exact same players, and I'm not sure I've ever seen a team flick a switch overnight to go from being a very dour team who I really don't even want to watch play football to all of a sudden being exciting to watch, winning football, and I drive a fair distance to go and watch them play.
Jesus, that's saying an awful lot now. A North Tip hurling man driving to see Galway play football.
I'm a good football man too. County minor title winner 2000. Fair enough, it was B. But no, I do.
Hey, B football. Counts. B counts. I have a county minor B hurling medal there somewhere, so that all counts. Anyway, back to Galway. I think what possibly happened with Galway back over the last few years with Kevin Walsh and with the style of play he wanted. In fairness to Kevin, he took over Galway at a point where they were leaking scores. They looked weak. They really weren't. They had a relatively limited panel of players that you needed to create a template for a tactical template that you could get the best out of what was a fairly limited pool of players at the time. So he went down this road of sort of utilitarian football, if you like, sort of football by numbers, and trying to mould Galway in a certain way. And you could see it, and in all the conversations with people down there all the time, the players had to really concentrate on what they were doing because it wasn't a natural style of play for them. Now, I'm a bit allergic as well to this idea that counties have natural styles of play, but I do think there is something to it, that if you can get them playing a style that they've grown up with as kids and that they've watched, obviously that's going to be easier for them to do. So in this case, I think Galway kind of got caught, it just got wrapped up in knots a little bit. They never looked comfortable playing the way they did, but at the same time, I suppose they had gone so far down that road that it was very hard to turn the ship around again. And equally, better players were coming on stream, and players were maturing, and guys were showing certain abilities that maybe the panel that Kevin would have had originally didn't have. So it's been a difficult period for them. Like, I mean, they were able to completely shut Mayo down with that style of play that they had. And I mean, that was a Mayo team that was going for All Ireland at that time. So I mean, there was merit to some regard to what they were doing. It was, I suppose, they just needed wins for self-belief. But now they have that self-belief, and I suppose the issue coming into this year with a new manager was, okay, we need to find a style of play that's going to move us forward. I'm a strong believer that mass defence does not. I mean, people can argue about Tyrone winning All Irelands with mass defences. Tyrone won All Irelands because they had 6 unbelievable forwards back at that time, and it's the one saving grace of football, is that the team with the best forwards nearly always wins the All-Ireland. Even Donegal back in 2012, you look at the forwards they had back that time, superb forwards, right? That's what wins you games. That's what Galway have. They have some excellent forwards. As you say, it's marrying that sort of defensive rigour and that hardness as well. I mean, back when Galway were winning All-Irelands 20 years ago, you had, Tomas Mannion in there and these guys who were really, really good technical footballers, but they were hard as nails. They were made of wire, some of these lads. And, they need to get that back into their team as well. They need they need to bare their teeth around the middle a little bit. They need to show that kind of, and that's a part of Galway football that's as much a part of winning Galway teams as the stylish footballers that you get the likes of Shane Walsh now at the moment. But I think that, look, it's good to see them going well. And they're a team that you could say, they need a good league would be good for them,
Just we could talk football all day. I do want to bring up the fact that it's the 100 years since Bloody Sunday, and of course you did that brilliant book, The Bloody Field. You're going to do an update this year. Can you just explain what brought you to do an update?
Yeah, well, I suppose the fact that it's the centenary anyway this year, you obviously be looking at it and going, well, can we do something, So I suppose back that time, the first book came out in 2014. So around back that time, it was difficult, obviously, to try to find family members of people who were related to the victims, because, I mean, just finding their stories in itself was a job. There was a lot of needles and haystack type research. So if you found any family members, it was kind of by luck and by, you were just delighted. But in the meantime, we've been able, obviously, with the book coming out, and also you had the Bloody Sunday, the GAA's Bloody Sunday Graves Project, which when, back in 2014, 2015, there was 8 of the 14 victims were on unmarked graves. So the GAA, in conjunction with the families, have erected 7 graves out of 8 now, gravestones out of 8 for them. So you were able to obviously meet the families through that. So through all of that, you were able to talk to them and kind of find out more about their experience of their relatives dying and how it impacted on the families through the years, and also just add more detail to the stories of the victims that would have come from the family stories. And I suppose how Bloody Sunday and the massacre in Croke Park is perceived now, because I suppose when the book came out, there wasn't really an awful lot. There'd only been ever one other book written about Bloody Sunday, and that was back in the 60s. And that was mainly about the Michael Collins stuff in the morning. So, I mean, this was kind of the first book, the first effort to kind of put shape and make on the Croke Park aspect of that day. So I suppose it allowed however many people wanted to kind of sort of engage with that story a bit more and make sense of it a little bit more and kind of think and absorb it a little bit more in different ways. And I think, a lot of aspects of that story are, even though it happened 100 years ago, they are relatable. I mean, you've 3 schoolboys, 10, 11, 14 years of age died. I always think, and particularly in the last little while, Jerome O'Leary was one of the people who we put a gravestone up for last November at the anniversary. And Jerome was 10. He was the youngest of the victims to die. He has no family left. So the lads in Croke Park were calling me to say, look, can you just corroborate his name and address and basically be the point of contact for a child who has no family anymore. And I said a few words at the grave as well. And it just it gets you thinking, geez, I mean, certainly number one, this certainly wasn't what I expected to be doing when I wrote that book 6 years ago. But secondly, I was 10 when I went to my first match in Croke Park. It was my first time in Croke Park when I was 10 years of age. And, you just immediately, I can remember being so excited about going there, and I can remember a good bit about the day and all. And you just think, well, Jerome at 10, that's the excitement he would have had, so you can relate to that. You can relate to, one man went to the game, James Matthews, his wife was pregnant. He had 2 daughters at home. You can relate to him as a father and an expectant father. It's all sorts of aspects to it, and their jobs, their ages, where they were coming from, their backstories, what they were doing, and the very fact that they were going to Croke Park, like we all have down the years, to watch a game and to enjoy the game. And the very last thing that was on their minds, or on anybody's mind, was that there was going to be something so appalling and so tragic happen. So I suppose all of those themes and all of those ideas kind of even came more to the fore in the last 5 or 6 years. And I mean, it's been, I found it at times a very emotional kind of, I don't want to say journey, but very emotional episodes, we'll say, deriving from the book, meeting families, going to the grave commemorations, talking to people about it, and seeing how it impacts on people. It changes you. It changes you, and it kind of certainly, I just felt that the year that was in it, it was it would be nice and it would be important to try and reflect some of that in an updated version of the book.
And would you have go down that rabbit hole in terms of how it made you feel, and saying the words at Jerome O'Leary's graveside? That must have been a very, very unusual feeling, was it?
Well, it was. I'll be honest with you. It was actually it was a privilege, to be honest. It was a real privilege to be asked to speak about somebody that you didn't know, but that you kind of felt a certain and I'm always very conscious, because I've kind of had this story in front of me for the guts of 10 years now. This isn't my grief. The grief is the family's grief, or the loss of the family. It's not my loss. But having kind of walked through some of these stories and kind of looked into these stories, I do feel a certain caring for all of them. And funny enough, with Jerome, when I was researching, one of the places I went was the National Newspaper Library in London. And looking through the tabloid newspapers at the time, I found a picture of Jerome. So I always had a picture of him, which you couldn't say for all the victims. I've now got pictures of maybe 8 or 9, I think. But Jerome was one of the only ones I had back then. And you'd look at this kid, and you just think, Christ, I mean, he went to a match. He was 10 years of age. Somebody saw him and actually lifted him up onto the back wall of the canal end so he could see the game better. And then the shooting started, and he was the second victim. The second bullet hit him. The randomness of it, and then being asked to speak. Sorry, to go back to your original question. I mean, the feeling was you're just holding it together, and you just want to do him justice, because after 99 years, his memory had been forgotten. I mean, it's true, and I'm not blaming anybody for that. It's just life. His story and his name had been forgotten. So I just wanted to do him some kind of justice, and respect his memory, and make sure that whoever was there that day went away knowing Jerome's name and knowing a little bit more about him, and maybe thinking slightly differently about what happened that day.
You've been very good with your time, but there's just one other thing I wanted to ask you. I mean, I could talk to you all day about that, but one thing in particular, were there many myths about that day at Croke Park that you kind of had to debunk, or you found out, Right, well, there's this story, for example, the Michael Collins portrayal of it, the tank rolling onto the field. Was it very different to how people would have thought about it in popular culture?
Yeah, short answer, yeah. And there's two aspects to the myth thing. The first aspect is what you mentioned there. We say the Michael Collins, the media portrayal of it. Let's say, right. So you have the Michael Collins, the machine. An armored car rolls on. If people can't remember, an armored car rolls into the middle of Croke Park, and basically a machine gun opens fire on the crowd. That never happened. That never ever happened. What I'd say about that is that, in fairness to Neil Jordan, that was 1996, 97, that movie came out. We didn't have the information in 96, 97, unless Neil Jordan went back and combed the newspapers at the time. The information wasn't easily available to him to actually depict what happened exactly. There was two inquiries done at the time into what happened in Croke Park. The reports they weren't even published. Actually, they were sealed for 90 odd years. They weren't actually made available to the public until 2003, 2004. So it was only then that we could really see exactly what happened. So you have that aspect of it, but then you have another aspect, which is small little things, like, for example, a lot of people thought it was an All-Ireland final. It was a challenge game. Michael Hogan, the tip player who was killed, people said he was the captain. He wasn't. He was a young fella in his second year on the tip team at cornerback, who was extremely worried about marking the best forward in the Dublin team. So small, bits and pieces that, when you add them all together, give you a very different kind of sense of the game. Like, you had I went back looking at the numbers, how many were killed. Some said 12, some said 16, some said 15. The names of some of the victims were wrong, basically, even on plaques and stuff like that. They were just wrong. So you had that aspect of it. You also then had the aspect of family stories. And in some cases, stories went down through families and through communities about what happened. Some of them were right. Some of them were half-truths. Some of them were maybe told as truth, but they weren't right, basically. Like, there would have been, I can think of one in particular, without saying which the victim was. They were saying he was shot, but if you looked at the autopsy report, which I was able to look at, you could see that he had been crushed and trampled, for example. But obviously, being shot was a very emotive thing for the family, and they were happy to believe that he was shot, and that's fine. So you had a lot of that kind of sort of push me, pull you, kind of nip and tuck around the story. And as I'd say to people when I'd be talking to them, I respect entirely whatever the story anybody has been reared with. I'm only coming to this and just pulling together as much as I possibly can, and giving what I believe is the version of the story that I think is the most accurate. But if anyone came to me with absolute solid evidence that something that was there was different, I was always happy to change it. And there are tweaks in the new update to kind of reflect that more information comes on stream, more official information, and more family stuff comes on stream that we can now feed into it. Like, history, it's funny because history is something that happened before, so the story is over. But these stories are always evolving, because we can always learn more about stuff that happened in the past. If you ask 10 people to describe one incident, you probably get 8 or 9 different details in all of those accounts. So that's why history evolves constantly, and you're constantly revisiting it and revising it and trying to bring it even closer to the actual truth of what happened. And that's been the case with the Bloody Sunday story all the way along. And it's been challenging, trying, heartbreaking, enjoyable, exciting. It's had a huge impact emotionally, mentally, everything. And people might be going, what is he talking about? How can something that happen? But it does. It does. When you walk into this, and I've seen it, I've told this story to people just chatting in a pub or chatting over a cup of tea or whatever, and it does something to people. It does something to people all the time. John Horan mentioned the 14 victims in his speech on Saturday at GAA Congress. The last time I checked, which was yesterday, there was nearly 20,000 views on that 2 minutes of footage on Twitter, which it amazed me again, because I was like, where there's an emotional pull to this story that I think people can actually relate to. They can relate to it once they open themselves up to the story and let it in at all. It draws them in, and it's what happened to me, and I think it's what I've noticed has happened to other people who've engaged with the story as well.
Yeah, I've read your book, and plenty of people who I know have. Just think it's great stuff, and I'd encourage anyone to have a listen or a read of it and check out maybe the update too. But you've been very good with your time, Michael. So I appreciate you joining me talking about all sorts there, and hopefully we'll do it again soon.